Hello everyone, I'm Hamza Omer from the ECE Department of University of Connecticut. In this talk, I'll be talking about my research work on IRONHIDE, which is a secure multi-core architecture that efficiently mitigates microarchitecture state attacks for interactive applications. This paper was published and presented at the 26th IEEE International Symposium on High Performance Computer Architecture, or commonly known as HPCA. Just to give you a brief introduction, we know that the processor trusted computing base, also known as the hardware root of trust, in modern processor designs is increasingly being attacked with a variety of software level and physical level exploits. For instance, we have seen attacks such as Spectre and Meltdown causing a havoc in terms of information leakage. If we look closely, the main enabler behind these threats is the virtualization capability introduced in modern systems, by means of which multiple security critical and off the shelf processes temporarily execute on the system and share hardware resources. Indeed, the sharing of hardware resources yields interference and thus information leakage. Therefore, given these security challenges, it is becoming imperative to consider security as a critical component in designing next generation secure processors. In this work, we specifically focus on microarchitecture state attacks, and the objective of this work is to figure out how can we efficiently mitigate these attacks in secure processor designs. Now the question is, what are microarchitecture state attacks? These attacks predominantly fall into two categories, where the first one is a non-speculative microarchitecture state attack, while the second one is a speculative microarchitecture state attack. In non-speculative microarchitecture state attacks, an adversarial program co-executes temporally with the victim program and monitors all of its excesses. Later, it leaks the confidential data through timing information on a shared hardware structure. Examples of such attacks include prime plus probe, flush plus reload, etc. In such a setup, the attacker co-executes alongside the victim process, and at first, it pollutes a targeted shared hardware resource, for example, level 2 cache, with its data accesses and then allows the victim to run its code. Now, the data for both programs co-locates on these shared hardware resources. Now, the attacker context switches in, observes the state of the prime cache sets, and notes that for certain cache lines, it observes a hit, whereas for some, it observes a cache miss. Based on this timing difference, the attacker reveals the access pattern of the victim. Now, moving on to the speculative microarchitecture state attack, these attacks are conducted in a similar fashion. However, a compromised insecure process containing gadgets makes speculative accesses to the privileged data and brings it to the shared hardware resource, such as caches, and then later conducts the similar non-speculative microarchitecture state attack as I described before. Examples of such attacks include Spectre, Meltdown, Foreshadow, and so on. Now, to address the security challenges, a variety of mitigation schemes have been proposed in the literature, where these schemes predominantly fall into two categories: software-based and hardware-based. In terms of software-based solutions, process-level isolation is generally assumed that ensures memory-level isolation across processes. However, the shared hardware layer is still vulnerable. Now, the hardware solutions can be further categorized into two types. The first category involves traditional non-enclave based solutions. However, these works ensure partial protection against the microarchitecture state attacks. The other type of the hardware-based solutions is the enclave-based solutions, where works such as DOG, Sanctum, MI6 extend the enclave execution model to execute secure processes in isolated containers called enclaves and assure guarantees to prevent all possible microarchitecture state attacks by adopting isolation principles. Now, due to their commercial adoption and high security guarantees, we consider enclave-based solutions as a starting point in this work. Now, focusing on to the enclave-based security solutions, in this talk, I'll be primarily talking about the commercially adopted Intel's SGX and academic MI6 secure processor, and I will highlight their performance and security limitations. In Intel SGX, security critical processes always execute in pristine and isolated containers called enclaves. These enclaves temporarily coexist and co-execute alongside the insecure, ordinary off-the-shelf processes. For every enclave entry, the processor is first switched to the enclave mode where the secure process is first attested. Upon passing the authentication checks, the data for the secure process is decrypted for execution. Now, moving forward, for every enclave exit, all enclave-related data is first encrypted and the core pipeline is flushed to create a pristine execution environment. Later, the processor is switched to the normal mode to execute ordinary processes. However, in this figure, we see that the program data now coexists in the shared hardware resources, by means of which the insecure process can now conduct all possible microarchitecture state attacks, and this has been even shown in prior works. Now, moving on to the state-of-the-art MI6 secure processor, this architecture considers the Intel's SGX enclave execution model and takes a step ahead in addressing Intel's SGX security challenges. MI6 enables strong isolation to protect all possible microarchitecture state attacks, which is formally defined as no insecure processes must be able to infer anything private or secret about the secure process via the shared hardware resources. Following this definition, MI6 statically partitions the large stateful resources such as shared caches, TLBs, and off-chip memory across a secure enclave and insecure processes. For per-core small private resources such as private caches and core pipeline, it purges these resources on every enclave entry and exit. Adopting these mechanisms allow MI6 to protect against all possible microarchitecture state attacks. Now, let's just take a step ahead and understand the execution lifecycle of MI6 enclave executing alongside an insecure process. Assuming the secure process starts first, it utilizes the dedicated shared cache partition and pollutes the private resources with its data. Upon a context switch, the private resources are pushed to create a pristine execution environment, and the insecure process comes in to execute. Similar to the enclave, it utilizes its dedicated shared cache partitions and pollutes the private resources, which are pushed again on a context switch to let the secure process execute. However, over here, if we look closely, the purge operation is invoked on every process interaction, which impacts performance. A prior work, Hotfalls, has reported these overheads to be in several microseconds for Intel SGX. Moreover, MI6 suffers from several milliseconds overheads in this case due to the purging operations to ensure strong isolation. Furthermore, these purging overheads are expected to stack up and rise as the frequency of interactions between the enclave and the insecure process increases. Indeed, higher the interactions, higher will be the enclave entry and exits, and naturally, MI6 will suffer from higher purging overheads. Another issue is that the static partitioning of shared cache resources impacts performance as any given process may demand a larger shared cache capacity, resulting in higher cache misses, and this indeed lowers performance. These challenges make us think that can secure processor architectures enable strong security yet ensure high performance? To answer this question, we propose IRONHIDE in this work that addresses the performance challenges of MI6 and ensures strong isolation for security. In this work, we propose to take a step ahead in the context of multicores. To give you an overview, IRONHIDE creates two physically isolated clusters of cores, a secure cluster and an insecure cluster, where respective secure and insecure processes temporarily execute. These clusters are strongly isolated to ensure high security. Moreover, IRONHIDE makes these clusters reconfigurable in their size while keeping the same strong isolation guarantees intact. This reconfiguration capability enables load-balanced high performance, thus addressing the performance limitation of MI6. It also adopts a secure communication capability from prior works for process interactions. However, IRONHIDE enables this communication such that whenever a secure process interacts with the insecure world, it does not need to context switch out, thus limiting the purging overhead problem of MI6. By following these steps, IRONHIDE achieves high performance while ensuring strong isolation. We will discuss these capabilities one by one. However, we will first go through the threat model assumptions made in this paper. The threat model assumptions considered in this work are adopted from the state-of-the-art MI6 secure processor, where the processor hardware and the secure kernel are assumed to be trusted, and the operating system and the user applications are assumed to be untrusted. The application code is assumed to be publicly available, and the capabilities of the adversary to conduct the microarchitecture state attacks are assumed as it can temporally or spatially collocate with the victim process on the processor. It can also monitor the shared hardware resources such as caches and TLBs in terms of monitoring the timing information. And lastly, it also has the capability to train the speculative execution units such as branch predictors to conduct speculative microarchitecture state attacks. Now, in order to bring IRONHIDE into reality, it is essential to answer these three key questions. That is, how can we actually form clusters in the system? And when we have the clusters, how will applications execute in the system? And when the applications are executing, how can we make these clusters reconfigurable so that we can achieve load balance performance? So, for strong isolation, all core level resources of the system are specially partitioned to form a secure and an insecure cluster of cores, where secure and insecure processes temporarily execute. To form these clusters, first, IronHide maps the process threads to respective cores. This results in isolating the per core private resources of the system, such as private caches, TLBs, and core pipeline. To isolate the shared cache resources, the memory pages of any given process are mapped to dedicated shared cache slices. Next, each cluster is provided with dedicated memory controllers, which are further connected to separate memory modules, or DIMMs, that map the memory pages and data structures of the process that is deployed on that cluster. Naturally, all shared cache misses of the process are routed to these dedicated memory controllers. Lastly, multicores enable deterministic XY and YX routing protocols, and ensuring all the three aforementioned steps assure that the on-chip network also stays isolated. To ensure a secure communication channel, IronHide adopts a shared memory interprocess communication protocol that carry out interactions across secure and insecure clusters. This shared IPC buffer resides in the memory regions of the insecure cluster, and the insight here is that this does not violate strong isolation because 1. The insecure cluster never accesses any of the memory regions allotted to the secure cluster, and the second is that the data to be shared across clusters is anyway not security critical and is necessary for application progress. The strong isolation in this case is never violated. In terms of achieving high performance, Ironhide pins the secure processes to execute in secure cluster where it spatially interacts with the insecure process via the shared IPC buffer. Since the secure process is pinned, there is no need to perform any enclave exit on every interaction across clusters. Thus, Ironhide incurs no purging overheads, which were observed by MI6. Moreover, to cater for the varying core level resource demands of applications, Ironhide enables a capability to reconfigure cluster sizes for ensuring load balance system performance and throughput. This capability we will definitely discuss later in the slides. So now that we know how clusters are formed in Ironhide, let's try to understand how applications will execute on Ironhide given all capabilities. Ironhide adopts the enclave execution model where we generalize the concept of enclaves with secure processes. Every application comprises of multiple secure and insecure processes which frequently interact with each other to assure application progress. Moreover, multiple of these applications temporarily execute on the system such that the secure processes always execute on the secure cluster, whereas the insecure processes always execute temporally within their insecure cluster. Regardless of whether they belong to the same application or different, the insecure processes execute in a traditional time multiplex manner in the insecure cluster, where they demand no purging or cleanup mechanisms. However, Ironhide implements special handling for the secure processes to execute in the secure cluster. In case the secure processes belong to different applications, Ironhide considers these secure processes to be mutually distrusting and utilizes the similar execution model as adopted by MI6, where the large memory resources such as shared caches and off-chip memory are partitioned across the secure processes, and the temporally shared private resources are purged on every secure process entry and exit to create a pristine execution environment. In contrast, if multiple secure processes belong to the same application, Ironhide considers these processes as mutually trusting. In this case, the data for these processes coexists in dedicated hardware resources of the secure cluster. The applications deployed on the system comprise of frequent interactions across secure and insecure processes, which results in frequent secure process entries and exits. Ironhide in this case exploits performance by spatially pinning the secure processes to the secure cluster by means of which it incurs no purging overheads. In the case if there exists no secure process, the dynamic reconfiguration capability allows the insecure cluster to take up all the system resources to exploit multi-core parallelism. Same is done if we have no insecure processes and the secure cluster acquires all the system resources. So now that we know how applications will execute on IronHide, let's try to understand how the dynamic reconfiguration capability is added to the system. To achieve load balance performance, IronHide enables a capability called dynamic hardware isolation to reconfigure core-level resources across the clusters, such that the secure cluster can gain or give away cores to the insecure cluster. For instance, in this figure, the secure cluster gives up 16 cores to the insecure cluster for better overall performance and throughput. However, whenever cores are given away from one cluster to the other, the data for both processes now coexist in these resources, which is dangerous as an adversary can now conduct attacks. Thus, the first point is how can we regain strong isolation in this case? And the second is to know of a mechanism that can allow us to decide how many cores must we reconfigure across clusters for load balance performance. Let's first look into how strong isolation is actually violated due to dynamic reconfiguration of clusters and how can we regain strong isolation. In this figure, we see that the insecure cluster gains resources from the secure cluster. Evidently, the core pipeline, private caches, and network routers get shared between the clusters. This violates strong isolation as cache side-channel attacks can be conducted on these cache and TLB resources. And moreover, since the data for the insecure process is still pinned to the shared cache slices of the cores reallocated to the insecure clusters, the adversary can contend on these shared network routers to monitor the traffic destined to the secure cluster. Similar threats can be conducted when the secure cluster gains resources from the insecure clusters. Thus, there is a need to employ mechanisms for regaining strong isolation. To regain the strong isolation and to enable secure reconfiguration of clusters for all dynamically reallocated cores, the private resources, that is, the private caches and TLBs, pipeline buffers, are flushed and invalidated, and the memory pages are flushed, invalidated, and reallocated such that each cluster now holds the data for its respective deployed processes. Adopting these procedures close all the leakage channels and regain strong isolation guarantees. Now, the next essential step is to figure out how many core level resources must be reconfigured across clusters to enable load balance performance in IronHide. In IronHide, dynamic hardware isolation enables a reconfiguration capability to load balance clusters. However, we need to be a bit careful over here as the continuous reconfiguration of resources reveals information about the secure process to the adversary via the timing and termination channels. This leakage can be bounded by limiting the number of reconfiguration events. Therefore, IronHide adopts a security-centric core reallocation predictor that finds a single resource binding for each interactive application to ensure bounded leakage. Moreover, the resource bindings computed by the predictor for any given application remains consistent, thus ensuring deterministic binding for every given application. The adopted core reallocation predictor computes the resource binding using the shared cache misses per kilo instruction information of individual processes as a function of core counts. Now the question becomes, why use MPKI as a metric for load balancing? The reason is that from our analysis and other prior works, we have seen that MPKI trends highly correlate with the performance trends of applications as the cores are varied. Given this high correlation, minimizing for MPKI highly relates to maximizing for performance. The core reallocation predictor assumes that the MPKI trends of the processes are computed offline because the applications are assumed to be publicly available and their MPKI trends can be statically pre-computed using representative inputs. The second is that the computation of finding the resource binding is done online using slope-based search heuristic, which we will discuss next. Now, the MPKI trends generally have a nonlinear region, a linear region, and a saturation region. For achieving optimal performance, the process must operate at the saturation point, shown as B over here, or beyond the saturation point. At the minimum, it must operate within the linear region for better performance. The basic idea of the heuristic is to first capture point B and retrieve the resources at this point to find the required resource counts for both processes to work in an optimal fashion. If the required resources turn out to be equivalent or lesser than the total available system resources, shown as N over here, then it means we have achieved our load balance resource binding. Otherwise, We capture another point to retrieve the linear region, find the slope of this region using points A and B, and lastly, remove the additional resources proportionally based on the slope of each process's linear region. Let's go through an example for both of these cases. In this example, the resources required for LXNet to have optimal performance are 48 and 12 for vision. We calculate their sum to find the ideally required resources for optimal performance, and it turns out that the ideally required resources are lesser compared to the total available resources, which are 64 over here. Thus, the heuristic deploys this resource binding, as this binding provides us with load balance performance anyway. Now let's consider another example where the resources at point B turn out to be 56 and 16. Clearly, the sum of these resource counts turn out to be greater than the total available resources, which is 64. Thus, we need to remove these additional cores to satisfy the constraint. The heuristic then captures point A and computes the slope of the linear regions for both processes. The resources are removed such that the lesser number of resources are removed from the process which has a higher absolute slope value of the linear region, as higher slope defines that it is more sensitive to resource removal. Therefore, the heuristic removes 3 resources from SSSP and 5 resources from the graph process and deploys this resource binding for load balance performance. To summarize, IronHide creates two physically and strongly isolated clusters of cores where secure and insecure processes temporarily execute in their respective clusters. IronHide pins the secure processes to the secure cluster to avoid microarchitecture state purging overheads. Moreover, it enables a capability that allows clusters to dynamically reconfigure resources across one another to achieve load balance performance while keeping the same strong isolation guarantees intact. Now, in terms of the methodology to evaluate the design, IronHide is prototyped on a real multi-core setup called Tilera TileGX72. The reason for adopting Tilera in this work is that it provides all capabilities to form strongly isolated clusters by mapping threads to cores and pinning memory pages to dedicated memory regions. It also enables flush, invalidate, and page reallocation mechanisms for dynamic hardware isolation. Tilera contains 72 VLIW cores with a cache hierarchy of level 1 and level 2. It contains a total of 23 MB cache capacity and comprises of 4 on-chip memory controllers mapped to respective memory modules or DIMMs. For evaluation purposes, we use 64 of 72 cores. In this work, we consider two different interactive applications. The first set is the low interactive user-level applications where we consider perception and mission planning, graph processing, and query encryption. In each of these subsets of applications, the processes marked as blue are the secure processes, which frequently interact with the insecure processes marked in green to assure application progress. Similarly, the second set of applications is the OS-level interactive applications, where the secure memcached and light-TPD processes interact with the insecure operating system. The user-level applications are considered as low interactive as they incur only 400 secure enclave entries and exits per second, whereas the OS-level applications are considered as highly interactive as they perform around 200,000 interactions per second, and these numbers are corroborated with the prior work hard calls. Now moving on to the evaluation, I will first show results for low interactive user-level applications and then move on to the highly interactive OS-level applications. This figure shows the comparison of Intel SGX with the MI6 architecture. The left y-axis shows the completion times of these applications, and it is evident from the results that MI6 performs around 30% worse compared to Intel SGX. This is primarily because MI6 purges the private resources on each enclave entry and exit, resulting in high purging overheads. Now, this is just not enough because purging the state further impacts performance as the purged state needs to be brought back now, thus resulting in private cache thrashing. The MI6 performance also suffers because of static partitioning of shared cache resources, which impacts the shared cache utilization. On the contrary, Intel SGX does not suffer from such overheads because it does not implement strong isolation and does not partition the shared cache resources. However, it only purges the core pipeline on every enclave entry and exit, and the overheads associated with this are added to the completion time, which are negligible compared to MI6. To do an apples-to-apples comparison in terms of strong isolation, we compare MI6 with IronHide in this figure. The left y-axis shows the completion time of the applications, whereas the right y-axis shows the number of core-level resources reconfigured by IRONHIDE to achieve load balance performance. Clearly, IRONHIDE performs 32% better compared to MI6 primarily because of the fact that IRONHIDE pins the secure processes to the secure cluster by means of which it does not experience purging and thrashing overheads which were observed for MI6 before. Moreover, the dynamic hardware isolation capability of IRONHIDE enables intelligent distribution of cluster resources, which results in improved resource utilization. To see how resource utilization improves in the case of IRONHIDE, we observe the caching behaviors for both the systems. Clearly, MI6 suffers from poor L1 cache utilization due to frequent purging of the L1, which essentially results in cache thrashing. On the contrary, IRONHIDE eliminates private cache thrashing due to special pinning of the secure process on the secure cluster. In terms of shared cache, MI6 again observes poor L2 utilization due to static partitioning of shared cache slices across the processes. On the contrary, IRONHIDE, with its dynamic hardware isolation capability to reconfigure resources across clusters, eliminates the adverse impact of static partitioning. Now moving on to the highly interactive OS level applications. In this figure, we again compare Intel SGX with MI6. With such high interactions of OS level interactive applications, MI6 suffers from immensely high purging overheads. For example, we see that 70% of the total execution time for memcached and OS application is spent in purging the microarchitecture state only. Overall, we see a drastic difference of 77% in the performance of MI6 when compared with Intel SGX. Moving forward, when MI6 is compared against IRONHIDE, we see that IRONHIDE improves the overall performance by 3.1x over MI6 for OS level interactive applications. This is primarily because minimal purging overheads due to spatial pinning of the secure processes, and it incurs only one-time reallocation overheads across the clusters, and also because of better private cache and shared cache utilization. To conclude my talk, I would like to highlight that IRONHIDE exploits spatial isolation to form strongly isolated clusters of cores where interacting secure and insecure processes temporally execute in their respective clusters, by means of which IRONHIDE eliminates the microarchitecture state purging overheads by spatially pinning the secure processes on the secure cluster. Moreover, it incurs negligible dynamic reconfiguration overheads and improves the cache performance with the help of dynamic hardware isolation. All these aspects, when combined together, allow IRONHIDE to perform 2.1x better in terms of performance compared to MI6 while ensuring similar strong isolation guarantees. Thank you so much for finding the time to listen to this talk. I would encourage all of you to visit and go through the paper, and if there are any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. The details about the paper can be found below the video in the description section. Thank you.